Cathedral Formation. We are so glad to have you here. My name is Tina Clark. I'm the Director of Christian Formation at St. John's. And this is our first webinar, so bear with us as we do a little bit of technical learning. Our guest is securing power to her computer and will be with us momentarily. We're very glad you're with us to continue our opportunity to learn from this very important time and to welcome an artist and voice from the Black Lives Matter movement here in Denver, Adrienne Norris. We will do a question and answer session at the end of Broderick and Adrie's conversation. So if you have questions, please use the chat feature in Zoom to send those in, and we will have those ready at the end of the conversation. And without further ado, welcome to Canon Broderick Greer and our guest artist, Adrienne Norris. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, appreciate it.
Thank you, Tina. Over the past few months, cities across the United States have commissioned public art work in support of Black lives in light of recent iterations of state-sanctioned violence against Black people, namely Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, George Floyd in Minneapolis, and Elijah McClain right here in Aurora. Last month, a representative of Denver's Department of Transportation and Infrastructure approached our guest to commission a mural in that very strain near the corner of Broadway and Colfax. Setting it apart from similar works in Washington, D.C. and Seattle are three words our guest insisted on including, three words we will discuss a little later. Please join me in offering a warm St. John's welcome to public artist and historian, Adrienne Norris. And everyone's clapping, I'm sure. Adrienne, thank you so much for joining us today. We are honored to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Please tell us how you came to be involved in Denver's Black Lives Matter mural.
So I actually did some work with one of the members of the Women's Commission, and this is Kim Desmond, and she recommended me for the project. Once they knew that they were going to paint a mural on the street, they were looking for artists. They had approached two men, one white man, one black man. Black guy couldn't make it. And so, you know, Kim was like, guys, are you serious? You need a woman of color involved in this project. And so she reached out to me, let me know that it was going on, asked if I was interested, and then we began that conversation.
Wow. I know that before you did this mural, you were the creator and curator of a series called Women Behaving Badly. Mm-hmm. It's an art series and also the Women of Colorado trading cards.
Yes.
And you focus on the way that women in general and Black women in particular have been erased from popular histories. Can you say a bit more about that project leading up to the Black Lives Matter mural?
Absolutely. So yeah, I started the Women Behaving Badly series in 2016. So when the election was going on, and I have kind of a standing show at Coffee at the Point every year. And so the curator, Judith Weaver, was like, hey, I want you to do something. We got to do something about women. This is our year, you know. She was so excited. And I'd had this idea in the back of my mind for a while about doing something having to do with women in history. I hadn't formulated it yet. So when I did that first show, I saw not only the success of the show, but also just how people were engaging, how people were bringing their kids, you know, especially their daughters, to come see it, you know, and just really the kind of inspiration that folks were getting from that project. And so I felt it was really important to just keep it going, you know. So I've been doing 1 to 2 shows a year since then, and just, you know, adding to the series. And as I do more research, I'm learning so much more about the context in which these women lived. And, you know, because that gets us to the why, right? So you say Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman elected to Congress. Well, that's cool, but number one, why was that important? what was going on at that time. You know, why was that such a difficult thing to do? You know, and so why did it take 150 years after the founding of this country for a Black woman to be elected to Congress?
Mhm.
You know, and so it's that's the part that's been completely interesting me of late. So the stories of individuals, I kind of use as a lens to look through to figure out what was going on in the rest of the world, or in the world at least around them.
Amazing. And I think context is a great segue to our next question. You insisted, so the mural says, Black Lives Matter, remember this time. And you insisted on those last three words, remember this time, which is
I did.
about context. So please say more about that.
Yeah, we are in fascinating times right now. I mean, borderline unprecedented, because we are in a situation where internationally, so not just nationally, but even the national furor is impressive. Um, People are paying so much more attention to the social inequities, especially those that affect Black people in the United States. And we have had Black Lives Matter protests not only here at home, but abroad. And you have Black people in other cultures and other communities who are taking up our rallying cry and, you know, vying for their own rights as well.
Mhm.
And all of that, like, I've never seen anything like that. And even in the historical context, the fact that people are actively educating themselves, you know, all of that is just like mind boggling to me, in the best way possible, right?
Mhm.
And so we need to remember this, because this is an important time period that we're living through. We are literally in an historic moment. Um, And then the other thing that is essential to remember is that this is not the first time that we have protested police brutality. This is
Exactly.
not the first time we have protested, again, social inequalities that leave not only Black people incredibly vulnerable, but also they're geared towards Black people, but have a kind of trickle out effect. You know, like the systems that are put in place that, you know, imprison Black folk for, you know, the most minor of offenses, from, you know, drug possession to what have you, are also affecting, you know, people of other background, cultural backgrounds in this country, and imprisoning them for the same kinds of things. So, you know, if you don't target one group, if you don't come up with these rules that are trying to keep one group down, then actually a lot of other people are also able to transcend the kinds of things that are happening as well.
Mm.
So yeah, remember this time, as in this time for once. Can we please put this in the history books? Can we please continue the conversation? Can we make this a regular part of our oral tradition? Because we don't.
Well, and if you could also say a little bit more about um, how the non-Black public has often ended up not sustaining these intense moments of sweeping change,
Mhm.
like we've we've had in many ways the civil rights movement.
Yeah,
Um, we remember the activism of the early '90s after the beating of Rodney King by
yeah.
police. Um, Dr. King and other activists, Malcolm X, they mentioned police brutality in speeches in the 60s.
Hmm.
The Black Lives Matter movement, in many ways, started in 2009 with the killing of Oscar Grant, really came to a head with the non indictment of George Zimmerman in 2014, 2013,
Yeah.
Trayvon Martin, et cetera, et cetera. In many ways, why hasn't the non Black public gotten the message? And how can they sustain this message, embody it, and have policies that reflect it?
I feel a lot of that has to do with context. You know, the same reason that I don't just look up the story of one person, but I look up the story about why she had to do what she did, or why what she
Mhm.
did was, you know, pivotal. Um, there are a lot of people out there, especially non-Black folks, who feel like the protests are about one thing.
Mm.
You know, there are folks who honestly think that the current protest is just about George Floyd. It's like, no, George Floyd was the last straw in this moment, you know? And, you know, what we are protesting, what we get upset about is the systemic stuff that we experience all the time. But if you don't have context for that, then you think it's just about one thing. And then once that one thing blows over, then you're like, well, that one thing is done, then we're good. And so that's why I think it's so essential that so many people are educating themselves right now and actively looking up the history of Black people in America. The fact that Netflix and Hulu actually have, you know, sections called Black Stories or Black Lives Matter, where they're not just, you know, making you search for these things, but they're saying, here's a list of stuff you should know. Here's a list of, you know, essential stories that will give you context. And here is, you know, a list of the stories that we tell ourselves that for us is super, super obvious. But if you don't live this life, then you're not going to get it. So really the thing that I hope will continue to change, that I'm seeing, is this idea of getting the context, because once you have it, then you understand why all of this is so important.
Which sets us up for our next question. A common criticism of public Black Lives Matter murals is that they are a bold nod to the current moment, but they don't go far enough in enacting the change advocates for racial justice are calling for. In short, they're symbolic moves that lack the teeth of actual transformation. How do you respond to that line of criticism?
I agree.
You've heard it a lot.
I agree with the criticism. I think that is why I fought as hard as I did for those 3 words to be put in the end, remember this time. Because when I was first approached, they just said, we want it to say Black Lives Matter and we want it to represent Colorado. And that to me felt incredibly empty. You know, it felt performative. And I really insisted that there be a call to action. And I see those words, remember this time, as a call to action. Like once you know why I put them there, I would like to think that, you know, you'd be like, okay, this is what I can do. I have steps that I can take to move forward, you know? So yeah, I think that it really depends on how you do it. And I definitely think it depends on the conversation that you create around it. So, you know, I'm doing this interview with you today. I've had a number of interviews with podcasts, with various media outlets, things of that nature, because I really want to continue to push forward that message of we need a call to action. We need to stay on this path that we're currently on, and we need to not let up, you know, because otherwise then yes, it is just a performance piece.
And before we go to Q&A, you know, you're a Black queer artist, and not just an artist, but a public artist. If you would just say a bit about the potential that public art has to contribute to social transformation, and the power of public art through a Black queer feminist lens.
The beauty of public art is that it's in the public, you know, people can see it, and, you know, essentially draw their own conclusions. You know, there's no docent telling you why this piece was created or what have you. And so I am hoping that, you know, I've created something that will spark enough of a conversation, make people at least ask the question, why remember this time, you know? And I've engaged in conversations where folks have asked me your previous question of like, you know, if that's a performance, then why did you do it? What good does an art piece do compared to all the social injustices that are taking place, all the things that you're actually talking about? And that's the purpose, to start a conversation, to get people thinking along the lines of what it is that I've put on the wall or the ground or the canvas or whatever substrate that I'm working with. And so, you know, as long as the conversation continues, then I've done my job.
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Adri. We're going to hand it over to Tina for Q&A.
Thank you both so much. So Adri, one question we have is, who are some of the other artists who've inspired you in your career?
Oh man. There's a whole host of them for like technique, but I would say as far as that combination of technique and message, I love the work of Kehinde Wiley. He did the portrait of Barack Obama for the National Records or National Portrait Gallery. And the thing that I love about his work is that he's super intentional about, you know, taking Black people and especially like, you know, street, you know, like the image of the Black thug, quote unquote. And oftentimes, you know, the image of the gay Black man and putting them in this very white context, but exalting him. And these paintings are like larger than life. They're surrounded by beauty. The poses are reminiscent of, you know, a European painting. And it's basically saying like, you know, these people have been routinely erased from this milieu, like not able to be represented um, in those classical paintings, even though they totally were around at the time. And he's like, no, we're going to put these folks front and center, you know? So I love that kind of work. Who else pops into mind? I'm drawing blanks now. It's early, but that was the first one that I was like, yeah, this one I have to talk about for sure.
That feels important, the one that comes to mind even early in the morning.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask, the Black Lives Matter mural that you did on Broadway is temporary. Am I right about that?
It is temporary, yes.
Yeah.
I tried to fight for it being permanent, but there was not enough time for that battle.
Understandable. Has there been any discussion of something more permanent to mark this particular moment and the context of this moment somewhere else in the city?
Not for me. I haven't been part of that discussion, but I know that there are artists locally who are doing that kind of stuff. So, you know, to kind of swing back to the first question, there's an artist out here named Detour, Thomas Evans. He is a phenomenal person in general. Just like a really sweet guy, very, very intentional. His business acumen, I envy all the time. But he gets to do these amazing projects. And so he's painted a number of our fallen around the city during this time period. And so those are on walls. Those are, I think, commissioned more by private entities as opposed to public entities. So, you know, they're as permanent as they can be. And there's other artists similarly who are doing stuff. I've got a friend, Chelsea Lewinsky, you know, she's also doing similar kinds of work. So other people are part of that conversation. I'm actually relatively new to the mural game. That was my third one. So, you know, I'm still edging into that space.
Well, I think it was a great start, for whatever that's worth. You mentioned storytelling and using people's stories in your work. Are there one or two stories, particularly about maybe some Black women that we may not have heard of already, that have resonated with you, that we should find out about, that we should learn about?
Oh my God, there's so many. That's such a long list. Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna kind of trot out my favorites, you know. I'll start with Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was phenomenal. You know, she was an activist for the anti-lynching campaign. So if you want to talk about a story that has resonance today, I mean, what we're witnessing, the police violence and all that, that is modern day lynching. Ultimately, that is somebody being judge, jury, and executioner in a very short period of time and taking someone's life based mostly on the color of their skin. You know, you can justify actions all you want, but nobody deserves to die for selling cigarettes. Nobody deserves to die for being drunk and disorderly in public. There's a whole bunch of reasons not to die, but someone decided that that had to happen, you know? And so if you look back at Ida B. Wells and the ways in which she called out, white supremacy within the term context of, these Black men getting lynched in the South, and honestly all around the country. Like the South was the most prevalent, but it wasn't just there. And like her press got burned down. She was lucky that she was in a conference in another state when her press got burned down. Like they were gonna lynch her too. And so she's definitely worth looking into. I mentioned Shirley Chisholm earlier. The first Black woman elected to Congress in 1968. So this is after the Civil Rights Amendment has been passed. Or sorry, not amendment, but the Civil Rights Act, has been passed. The Civil Rights Act of 65. And there were a bunch before that. There's like Civil Rights Act 61 and then 62. And then finally they're like, all right, 65, let's do this one. But yeah, and even so, she got elected. And again, that was very performative. They put her in the Department of Agriculture. She was like, y'all, I'm from New York. I'm from Harlem. Why am I in agriculture right now? But she was able to transform that. And she created the Women, Infants, and Children program, which, provides food and milk for, mothers who are living below the poverty line. And that is something that didn't only affect Black people and Black women. That was something that affected everybody, and that kind of harkens back to what I said earlier. When you help the most vulnerable among us, everybody wins. Everybody has a chance to advance and get to, place where they at least have their needs met. And then we go beyond that, right? Who else? Who else would you not know of? Audre Lorde, she's a favorite of mine. So she was an activist, a poet. She was an educator, and mostly coming up in like the 60s and 70s. But she was on it until her passing in 92. And she was, one of the earlier people to talk about this idea of intersectionality before the term was coined, because she was gay, she was lesbian, proud, she was Black, and she was a member of the women's movement. And within each of these movements, there were people who wanted her to be only what fit perfectly into their box. So when she's, advocating for gay rights, they're like, cool, but let's not bring Blackness into it. That's just going to confuse stuff. Same thing was when she was working with, the women's rights movements. They're like, okay, but, Black and gay, that just completely confuses things. If you could just focus on women's stuff. And then with, Black movements, they're like, what is this gay women stuff? Like, this is Black men are dying in the street. We need to focus. And she's like, no, but I'm all of these things. You can't take little pieces of me and think that, I represent all of these, therefore I need to represent all of these in the way that I am, so that's something that's always been incredibly poignant to me, of making sure that I'm being as true to myself as I can when I'm being asked to do all these different projects, so that I'm not being pulled apart for somebody else's liking.
Absolutely. Well, and I think so much of the important context here is that we do need to appreciate each individual person for who they are and all the things that they are. Mm-hmm. So question from our senior warden: Netflix, Hulu, independent bookstores, and St. John's, and most churches are creating lists to read. They're encouraging people to learn, to white people to learn, to listen, to find out about this context. And Lee is asking, do you have a sense that making a change at this time with this effort, that maybe something's a little bit different this time?
Oh, it's absolutely different. Yeah, I mean, people are actively seeking out education. That is unprecedented. Like, I've never seen this before, even in the historical context, at least not to this scale, right? There've been individuals here and there've been groups that are started, but they're very grassroots and small. But for a major platform to say, okay, we are pushing out all of these stories and we are questioning the things that we've held as tried and true. The fact that Netflix pulled Gone with the Wind and said, we're going to put it back up once we have context, rather than making you think that slaves were happy all the time, because they weren't. You know, that's important. That's incredibly important. And if we stay on this path, I think we can actually make a shift, because I feel like there's a tendency for us to believe that because things have been printed, that we will read it. and, and we know our society right now, we're gonna do the easiest thing. Whatever's in front of us, that's what we're going to consume. Um, and so, you know, we can't just trust that something has been written or something has been told and we're good. We are still very much part of the oral tradition. You know, we like to think we've gone beyond that, we've transcended, but really, how do we tell stories? You know, how do we um, keep the myth of Thanksgiving alive? How do we keep the myth of, you know, the American independence alive? And I call, you know, a lot of American history as it has been taught mythology, because it's made to make us look good, and it's hidden all of the things that are super ugly that made us who we actually are. And so once we start bringing into our oral history, you know, our everyday verbal telling of these stories, the way that things have actually happened and the experiences that real people have had, that's when it's going to stick. Because right now we've not done it in a sticky way.
Yeah, thank you. Lee follows up by saying it feels different to her too, including marketing dollars being pulled from certain teams, from certain products. And I think that is important.
Yeah.
Adri, our time is almost up. I did want to ask you a little bit about your work outside the Black Lives Matter movement. And Broderick, I believe that you had a question around that. But would you tell us a little bit about what else you're working on?
Yeah. So I do want to clarify real quick. I am not actively a member of Black Lives Matter. Like, I am Black. I believe my life matters. I am intrinsically part of the movement, but I have not gone to meetings, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
So just wanted to clarify there. So yeah, the work that I do, the thing that's interesting me right now, and I've done a lot of research, and I will eventually put out a thing. So I spoke of context, and one of the contextual things that I want to reveal is the story of how women of color, or people of color, but through the lens of women, got the right to vote. And this is not something we talk about often. So we are in the 20 or 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So the amendment that, you know, technically gave women nationwide the right to vote. And but the thing is, that's not necessarily true. All women did not get to the right to vote 100 years ago. Well, white women got the right to vote. Black women almost had the right to vote, but then there's Jim Crow laws and actually the Black codes that came before it, and the voter suppression, the likes of which we still see today, that have prevented Black women from voting. When I started the project, I found one Native American woman from that period between 1848 and 1920. I found one Latin American woman from that period. I found two Chinese women, and I was like, where's everybody else? Come to find out, it's a matter of citizenship. A lot of those people were not citizens of this country, and therefore the question of whether or not to be able to vote wasn't even in their consideration. So I intend to create a graphic novel exploring the pathways that both hindered and helped different racial groups in the United States to gain the franchise of being able to vote and represent themselves and their own needs. And I'm doing that through the perspective of the laws that were passed. Because one of the things that I often run into whenever, you know, ideas and concepts of race and racial inequalities come up is that, you know, folks think that that's just opinion. And I figure if I anchor it in an actual law that you can look up, you know, there are a number of things just in the Constitution that already set the stage. If I anchor it in that, then hopefully people will be a little more attentive, and you know they'll believe it a bit more readily.
Thank you so much. Broderick?
Amazing. Thank you, Tina, and thank you, Adri, for joining us and being such a great guest, such a great conversation partner, and for being an important leader in our city and in our state. Thank you. Thank you.
And not to interrupt, but I hope that when that graphic novel comes out, will you let us know? Because we would love to see it.
Yes. And we'll have to have you back and
Absolutely.
have another conversation.
Sounds great.
This conversation, of course, was illuminating. It was challenging and helpful. And again, Adri, thank you for your courage and for embodying the words of Toni Morrison, that in this time of dread, unrest, and uncertainty, it is precisely the time when artists go to work. Thank you for being that artist, not only for yourself, but for us and for the whole world. Where can we find your work online?
So my company is Afro Triangle Designs. And so that's designs plural with an S at the end. So if you go to afrotriangledesigns.com, that's my main website. I'm also on social media. I mostly play on Instagram and Facebook. I'm technically on Twitter, but I honestly don't respond to much on there. But I'm at Afro Triangle. I'm both of those things as well. And then I have a Patreon account. So Patreon is kind of like, if Kickstarter never had an endpoint, then you can do like a kind of a monthly donation or whatever. And so that is actually Patreon, patreon.com/women behaving badly, because that's my main focus on that one. And so, you know, if you want to give a regular contribution just to make sure that these projects keep showing up, that's an option as well.
And we will try to get those links along with the recording of this video and make it available to people.
Cool.
Well, thank you again. Thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you, Tina. Thank you to Christina Rutland and Evans Owsley, our audio-visual ministry here at St. John's. And thanks to our participating community, our listening audience. Welcome to each of you, and thank you again for being a part of this important conversation. Enjoy your Sunday. We will see everyone in church at 10 o'clock.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.